If I had a nickel for every time someone went missing in basically the exact same part of Great Smoky Mountain National Park, I'd have several nickels, and I'm beginning to believe this may be a problem. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Over spring break in the year of 1975, 3 students from Eastern Kentucky University set off for a hike along the Appalachian Trail. One of them would turn back early, one of them would be forever traumatized, and one of them would never make it out of the park at all. The disappearance of Mark Hanson is yet another tragedy which occurred within the seemingly endless ridges of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and one considered by many to be rather mysterious. As the story goes, Hanson and his friend Ben Fish were several miles along the trail when the former, exhausted, declared that he was too tired to carry his backpack any further and dropped it on the trail. Then, sometime later, with shelter nowhere in sight and the cold, bitter darkness closing in around them, Hanson decided that he could go no further, sat down, and refused to continue. Ben was unable to convince him to keep on moving and decided the next best option was to continue on towards their destination where he hoped that he could find help, but he was unable to do so and ended up bedding down on the trail himself. What neither Fish nor Hanson knew, however, is that they were actually extremely close to safety, and all they needed to do was push on just a little bit further. To make matters worse for the whole situation, during that night on the trail, Fish said that he felt like he heard Mark Hanson screaming for help. When the morning came, Ben got up and immediately went to go looking for Mark. But when he arrived at the place where he left his friend the previous night, the man was nowhere to be found. So Ben turned around, went for help, and a search was launched. The effort which followed included hundreds of searchers, some helicopters, some dog teams, and some of the most confusing and contradictory reporting I've ever had to read. And for all the searching and journalism that was done on this case at the time, one question has gripped people since this story resurfaced around 2011. Why did Mark Hanson leave the trail? People wonder if he somehow lost track of it, or perhaps more importantly, and in a more sinister sense, was he compelled to leave? And if he was, by who or by what? And of course, did those screams that Ben Fish says he heard have something to do with it? And I will say, it's questions like this that often keep me up at night, and when you don't get a ton of sleep, you want to make sure that you have a really solid breakfast planned. And that's why I'd like to talk to you about today's sponsor for this video, Magic Spoon cereal and snack bars. Magic Spoon fits a variety of lifestyles. It's high protein, keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, wheat-free, and naturally flavored. And blueberry flavored in this case. The idea was to recreate cereal, you know? It's the same great taste that you remember from childhood when you used to sit down on a Saturday morning with a nice cup of cold, whatever was in your bowl, and it was delicious. But Magic Spoon, it's a little different. And when I say different, what I mean by that is that, it's upgraded. It's got grown-up ingredients. So yeah, grown-up ingredients, kid taste. Basically the best of both worlds. And what those grown-up upgraded ingredients get you are 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 4 to 5 net grams of carbs at around 140 calories per serving. And those snacks that Aiden threw at me earlier, well, those are just 1 to 2 grams of sugar, 11 to 12 grams of protein, and 1 to 2 grams of net carbs in each serving. They're also around a very reasonable 130 calories each, and high in fiber. And of course, as you all know, here at this channel, we're big fans of milk. And this is a great excuse for that too. Now personally, I had stopped eating cereal for a while. It just wasn't part of my lifestyle when I was in college. I was on the go a lot. I had weird hours. I still have really weird hours, but I found that if it's late at night and I'm doing a research session and I need a little boost, a bowl of cereal kind of hits the spot. So not only do I get to have a little boost during my 3 a.m. research sessions, but also I get to feel like a kid again. Except for the part about being up at 3 a.m. because that was outlawed in my home. And that 0 grams of sugar makes it really easy to not feel at all guilty about what I'm eating. If you're interested in trying Magic Spoon, then you can go ahead and click the link below to get your box of cereal today. In fact, you can build your very own custom box with all the flavors you love and use our code LORELODGE to get $5 off. You can choose from the best-selling cocoa, fruity, frosted, peanut butter, and maple waffle flavors, plus other awesome flavors like honey nut, blueberry muffin, that's this one actually, birthday cake, cinnamon roll, chocolate chip cookie. And you can also add any of their delicious little cereal treats to your order. Like seriously, these are like those little cereal bars you pick up at the grocery store as a kid. They're awesome. And Magic Spoon is so confident in this product that it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they will refund your money, no questions asked. So go ahead and click the link below or scan the QR code. This way. Better. Or scan the QR code and use code LORELodge to get $5 off, or just go to magicspoon.com/LoreLodge and save $5 off your order today. Also, for our Canadian and British friends, Magic Spoon does ship to Canada and the UK, so you can get it there as well. That's right, we got the Anglosphere on the cereal. Why are you still watching me eat cereal? Get back to the story. On Sunday, March 9th, 1975, John Chidester, Ben Fish, and Mark Hanson woke up at their campsite at Davenport Gap, a shelter and stop along the Appalachian Trail, which sits on the Tennessee-North Carolina border. The three men were in from Richmond, Kentucky, and planned to spend a few days on the trail, beginning their journey with a night of camping the previous evening. Originally a resident of Newport, Kentucky, Mark Hanson was a junior in college, having graduated from Campbell County High School in 1972. Newport, Kentucky, and Campbell County as a whole sit just south of Cincinnati, Ohio. Mark was active in his community and his church, often spending his summers working as a counselor for the St. John United Church of Christ's camp, and he also worked with food drives at the church around the holidays. Aside from that, very little information about Mark Hanson is available online or even in print, though we do know from Assistant Chief Ranger Jack Linehan that he was a novice hiker. And according to Mark's aunt, Carol Thompson, the boys intended to link up with another group of their friends further along the trail and finish the hike with them. And their plan overall seemed to have been to return on Tuesday the 11th. Exactly where they were supposed to meet up with these companions on the trail and when they were supposed to do so is unclear. That said, we do generally know their intended route. They were to begin at Davenport Gap on the eastern side of the park, then hike about 15 miles to Tri-Corner Knob Shelter, where they'd spend their first night. From there, they intended to hike another 15 or so miles to Newfound Gap, and that was to be the end of the trip. If you're experienced and properly equipped, this is about a 2-day hike. It also suggests that they intended to link up with their friends either at Tri-Corner Knob or sometime after Tri-Corner Knob. Just they probably weren't planning to meet them on the trail on the way there. The day that they set out, March 9th, was a cold day, registering just 46 degrees in Asheville, North Carolina to the south, and keep in mind, we're talking about up in the mountains. They were at around 5,000 feet. It should be said that the beginning of the trail is slightly lower in elevation, but the majority of this trek was going to be at the 5,000 to 6,000 foot level. What this meant was that up in the mountains, it was likely sitting around the freezing point, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius. Though clear skies meant that a properly equipped hiker should be fine. While what equipment the men had on them for the hike is unclear from news reports, it does seem that all three of them were properly equipped for the cold, but possibly not for the exertion. And I say that because just 2 miles into their hike, John Chidester began to complain about his boots, and said that he didn't think he would be able to continue. According to news reports from the time, he returned to Davenport Gap and then went to a ranger station. What he did after this is difficult to say because he basically just disappears from the record at this point. It may also be worth noting, however, that one of the rangers, Dwight McCarter, gave a slightly different account of events in his book, Lost, A Ranger's Journal of Search and Rescue. And in that version, Chidester made it further. He made it all the way to Low Gap before he gave up. Whether it was at Low Gap or just 2 miles into the hike as the newspapers reported, Hanson and Fish continued onward, stopping around noon for lunch at Mount Camerer. According to an article penned the following November in the News and Observer out of Raleigh, it was at this point that Mark first complained about leg pain and fatigue, but chose to continue at least as far as Cosby Knob Shelter, about 3 miles further down the trail. Some 2 hours later, they reached Cosby Knob Shelter, where Mark once again complained of discomfort in his legs, but he decided that they would go on to Tri-Corner Knob Shelter. This, however, would be another 7 or so miles, with only 5 hours to go until sunset, and more problematically, and unbeknownst to them, snow coming in from the west. That snow made its way towards the two men, and what had been a lightly snow-covered but well-tread trail quickly became a path through deep drifts as temperatures dropped further. At this point, it becomes difficult to determine precisely what happened next, as news reports are incomplete, and unfortunately I could not find a National Park Service report for this case. There probably is one out there, but I did not have time to file a FOIA request. I will try to do so before the analysis video. That said, we are asking the federal government to do something, more quickly than 10 years, so we might not get it. While all sources agree that sometime after leaving Cosby Knob, Hanson became tired and dropped his pack, and then, after a little while longer, sat down and refused to go on entirely, they don't all agree on the details. The News and Observer cites Chief Ranger Miller as writing in the report that as they passed Inadu Knob, Hanson told Fish that he couldn't keep going unless he left his pack behind. This article, however, also reports that Hanson stopped at Inadu Knob, which contradicts the majority of other reporting. Further complicating the matter, Ranger McCarter wrote that the pack was dropped at Camel Gap, about 2 miles before Inadu Knob. Also, if I'm pronouncing Inadu incorrectly, please correct me in the comments. Trying to find pronunciations of words this obscure online is not easy. Articles in the Kentucky Post and the Kingsport Times claim that Fish carried Mark's pack for some time, but do not address where the hikers ultimately left it behind. And then a different article in the Kingsport Times reports that the two men continued for 2 miles after leaving the pack behind before Hanson gave in. A March 12th article in the Knoxville News Sentinel says that Hanson decided he could go no further approximately 3/4 of a mile from the shelter, and most articles agree that from there, the next step was for Fish to leave Hanson on the trail and attempt to make it to Tri-Corner Knob, but he too failed to reach the shelter. He reportedly bedded down about halfway between Hanson and the shelter, unaware of how close he was. Sometime after leaving Cosby Knob, Mark said he could no longer continue while carrying the pack. Fish argued that he'd have to keep it with him and ultimately offered to carry it for some time, but when it became too heavy for him, he too dropped it. Precisely how far this was that he carried it is never mentioned. They eventually rounded the curve at Mount Guyot, and some 3/4 of a mile from Tri-Corner Knob shelter, an exhausted Mark Hanson sat down and refused to go any further. Fish desperately tried to convince Mark to finish the trek, insisting that they were close to their destination and that it was unsafe to remain out in the open. But Mark could not be moved, which meant that at this point, Fish really only had 2 options. He could stay with Mark and set up camp for the night, which would have raised Mark's chances of survival, but put him in more danger. Alternatively, he could seek aid at Tri-Corner Knob shelter, which increased his chances of survival, but put Mark in a precarious position if help could not be found. In the end, Fish chose the latter option, but failed to reach the shelter according to most articles. Some articles suggest that he did make it and stayed the night there. Another article suggests he went back to Cosby Knob shelter that night, which doesn't make any sense. The most likely course of events here is that he tried to get to Tri-Corner Knob and didn't make it. And from there, we have Ben Fish spending the night on the trail, and then we also have Mark Hanson back behind him. And this is where we get the story about Ben Fish hearing Mark screaming for help during the night, or that he considered it a possibility that he dreamed it. Initially, I believe that this claim originated with Dave Paulides' Missing 411 Eastern United States, and that was because I looked at a lot of contemporary news articles and none of them mentioned Fish hearing someone screaming for help. So I went and read Lost, Ranger's Journal of Search and Rescue by Dwight McCarter, and lo and behold, it is in there. So, as far as I can tell, that claim about Fish possibly hearing Hanson screaming, that does come from one of the Rangers who was involved. But whether Fish actually heard Hanson calling for help or not, there was nothing he could do about it. And so, Fish turned in for an uncomfortable night on the side of the Appalachian Trail, hoping and praying that his friend would make it until morning. When Ben Fish awoke on the morning of Monday, March 10th, 1975, he immediately went to look for Mark Hanson, but to his surprise, when he arrived where he'd left Mark, the man was nowhere to be found. Recognizing that this had quickly turned into something that he could not handle alone, he decided to continue to the nearest shelter, which was Tri-Corner Knob, and there he found 2 hikers who were willing to help him look for Mark. And in 18-degree weather, they began retracing Ben Fish's steps all the way back to Cosby Knob shelter. And along the way, they encountered Hanson's backpack, right where the boys had left it the day before. It hadn't been tampered with, and so far as they could tell, nobody had come back for it. From that point on, no further sign of Hanson was found between his pack and the shelter. According to then Chief Ranger Roger Miller, who is also referred to as Pat Miller in several articles, these guys decided that, they were going to play it safe and they were going to stay at Cosby Knob shelter for the night, then go look for help in the morning. But this is another instance where McCarter's narrative, which was published in 1991, contradicts the contemporary reporting. McCarter says that they reported Hanson missing Monday afternoon, while Chief Ranger Miller clearly stated that they stayed at Cosby Knob for the night. The following morning, they diverted off of the Appalachian Trail to the north, following the Low Gap Trail, eventually reaching Cosby Campground, where they reported Mark missing to the Rangers. Rangers responded immediately, all too aware of the danger that Hanson faced after the disappearance of 16-year-old Boy Scout Jeff Haig just 5 years earlier. Unfortunately, they were severely disadvantaged compared to that case, as Jeff Haig had been reported missing just hours after his disappearance. By the time Mark was reported missing, he had been in the cold for 48 hours and without his sleeping bag for about 36 of them. And to make matters worse, around 10 inches of snow had fallen since Mark disappeared, which would have obscured any tracks he may have left. So, some 40 Rangers were immediately assigned to the stretch of the trail where Mark had last been seen. And thankfully, they were actually able to receive immediate support from the air as a helicopter was on hand to look for tracks. Unfortunately, the weather was not on their side, with papers reporting both high winds and waist-deep drifts of snow along the AT. The result was that fresh snow made tracking Hanson's movements on the ground difficult, while poor flying conditions hampered the ability of the helicopter crew to do any meaningful work. Ranger McCarter, while he reports that the search started early Tuesday morning, does also say that they found Hanson's pack at Camel Gap, but no further sign of him. They continued on and checked out an old airplane wreck from 1962 that they felt Hanson may have used as shelter, but there was no sign of him there either. From there, they continued west to Tri-Corner, finding nothing along the way. With no further luck for the Rangers searching the trails, a very concerning reality was becoming apparent. Mark had left the trail, which significantly complicated the effort. Wednesday the 12th was worse than Tuesday the 11th, with weather conditions keeping the helicopter grounded and a grid search struggling along the ground. McCarter wrote that he was assigned to the northern slope of Mount Chapman, immediately west of Tri-Corner Knob and overlooking Buck Fork. They spread out down the side of the mountain, so from what I understand, you had basically a line of people that started up at the top and then went down to the bottom, and then they moved westward together. But anyway, they spread out down the mountain and walked in a loose grid search pattern. A quarter mile into that part of the search, somebody found a cave, and McCarter says that this person was slightly uphill of him. The Rangers were concerned that it could have been the den of a large predator, but they needed to check it anyway, and McCarter volunteered to be that guy.
You're not that guy, pal. Trust me. You're not that guy.
Okay.
Okay?
Are you?
Absolutely.
He crawled inside, he found some small animal bones and some fungus, but no sign of Mark Hanson. They determined that a bear, a big cat, or possibly even a boar inhabited the cave, but that Mark Hanson had not been inside. From the cave, they continued along the northern slopes, then toward Mount Sequoia, before searching around the southern slopes on the way back. So basically, they got around Mount Sequoia and then checked the southern sides of the mountains. They found more old, known plane wrecks, as well as a horse camp, but no sign of Hanson anywhere. The weather remained poor on Thursday, with McCarter reporting that it rained heavily, but also that it thankfully did make its way up into the 50s. For our friends on the Celsius system, because I don't have the conversion right in front of me, that's like hoodie weather or light jacket. This is just an extension of the anything but the metric system thing, I guess. On Thursday, the search was narrowed to a 1-mile radius around Tri-Corner Knob, with McCarter assigned to check the Yellow Creek drainage. I think he may have meant the Straight Fork Raven drainage, as he says that he was supposed to search to the southeast, and there also doesn't appear to be a Yellow Creek drainage, though there is a drainage with a Yellow Creek in it. By the way, a drainage is a place where all waterways lead into one waterway. I learned this during this research bit. So basically, if you're up in the mountains and you've got a few creeks running out of the mountains that all form one big creek, that's a drainage. I guess it would be the opposite of a delta. Anyway, they made their way down the Balsam Mountain Trail as far as Gunter Fork Trail, but found nothing along the way aside from an abandoned shed, which they did note could be used as a base camp if they found any sign that Mark was down this way. But Mark was not down that way. By Friday, the search was expanded to a 2-mile radius from Tri-Corner Knob, still with a focus on the major drainages that made their way down the mountainsides. Now within that radius, there are at least 6 waterways that match the description here, including Left Fork Raven Fork, Straight Fork Raven Fork, Big Creek, Deer Creek, Ramsey Prong, and Buck Fork. And to handle all of these areas, the Park Service could only muster 50 men during the week, so all that they could really do was add to the list of places that Mark Hanson wasn't. As far as this day of searching goes, McCarter wrote that he was assigned to check Mount Guyot and Old Black Mountain, but that nothing was found. Also, while McCarter said Old Black Mountain, I saw it referenced as Old Black on the maps. I'm not sure if this is a regionalism, if the name has changed over the last 50 years, but if you're local and it's Old Black down there, please don't yell at me. Hampered by bad weather and a lack of manpower throughout the week, things looked grim for Hanson by the weekend. What hope remained rested with some 200 searchers who arrived on Saturday the 15th. Assisting from the sky were 2 Army helicopters out of Fort Campbell on the Kentucky-Tennessee border, with a dog team added to the ground search. And though this was by far the greatest effort applied to the search so far, those involved were under no illusions about what they were most likely to find. While they hoped for a miracle, the men crawling amongst the snowy crags of the Smokies knew that this was almost certainly a recovery mission. McCarter wrote that they performed grid searches in the Big Creek and Buck Fork drainages, but to no avail. Mark's chances fell further with sunset on Saturday, and while the search did continue with a full 200 people on Sunday, Chief Ranger Miller told the media that rain, snow, and high winds hampered the search. So, at the end of the day on Sunday, they made the difficult decision to scale down the search, in no small part due to the inherent danger with searching the remaining areas. The small task force which remained on Monday the 17th was ferried from position to position by those Army helicopters, systematically clearing the drainages around Mark's last known position. And while they had checked a few of these areas before, there had been some snow melt, which meant things obscured at the beginning of the search might be visible at this point. And it was that Monday afternoon, around 2 p.m., that a search team checking the Buck Fork drainage found what they all knew was going to be awaiting them: the frozen body of Mark Hanson, some 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail. None of the articles I could find contained any further details about the discovery, but McCarter did give more information. He wrote that Mark was found sitting in an upright position, leaning against a rock and tree. His parka was open, his gloves and a boot were in the snow nearby. And upon discovering Mark, authorities attempted to reconstruct what may have led him to his position. And they determined that he most likely died within 24 to 36 hours of when he was last seen. Sevier County Medical Examiner Dr. Robert Lash suggested that Mark evidently chose to follow a watershed and got a lot further than we thought he could have in his exhausted state. And then, as he tried to make his way down the mountain by following the Buck Creek drainage, Mark most likely succumbed to a combination of exposure and freezing. As for the removal of his gloves and boot and the unzipped parka, they suggested that this was likely a case of paradoxical undressing. So he probably sat down against that tree to rest, took off his boot and gloves, and mercifully drifted off to sleep as hypothermia took hold. Mark's body was brought back, and his funeral was held 2 days later, and since it was published in the Kentucky Post, I thought I'd read you the article written about it. And it goes as follows. Aiden, give me the mood lighting. No one will ever know the thoughts that filled Mark Hanson's mind as he faced a cold and lonely death in the Smoky Mountains last week. No human hand comforted him, no one was there to hear his final prayers. But Mark Hanson was never abandoned, either by the God he worshipped or by the scores of friends and relatives who filled St. John United Church of Christ, Newport, Wednesday morning to pay their last tribute to the brave young man. Though he be dead, yet shall he live, Reverend William Schreer told the assembled congregation. And it was with the message of life and hope eternal through faith in God that he and Reverend Jack Romali sought to comfort the bereaved members of the Hanson family. All of us are caught up in what is clearly a tragedy, Reverend Romali said, but he asked the mourners to do some remembering, the kind of remembering which brings joy. Each of you knows what was good and true and beautiful in his life. He recalled the Mark Hanson he had known, the Mark Hanson who, having just returned from college, would come to the church to help deliver Christmas trees and Thanksgiving baskets to the poor. The Mark Hanson who gave of his time to serve as a counselor for the church in camp. An act of devotion, he told his listeners, is greater than any sermon. After the closing prayer and blessing, attendants wheeled the dark bronze casket with its spray of bright red flowers to the hearse for the short trip to Evergreen Cemetery. There, surrounded by the people among whom less than 2 weeks ago he had laughed and smiled, Mark Hanson was laid to rest. He was no longer alone. Not something I usually do with these cases, partially because we rarely have this kind of material about them, but when I thought about the fact that Mark had to leave this world cold and alone, I thought it might give his soul some comfort to know that he was remembered well. Forgive me my superstitions. Now, as for the official narrative in this case, the medical examiner and the National Park Service considered this to be a tragic, yet rather straightforward, accident. Some, however, aren't so sure about that explanation, and I'll admit that I, too, had some questions. Though certainly a lesser-known missing 411 case, the story of Mark Hanson has still made its way around the podcast and blog circuit, with a number of common questions arising. And there are a few central points, most of which arise from missing 411 Eastern United States. These are: why did Mark remove his boots and gloves, and why did he unzip his parka? Why did he leave the trail? If he collapsed from exhaustion, how did he make it another 2 miles into the drainage? And why was he calling for help? And in addition to those, I had a couple of my own questions. Primarily, why does McCarter's account differ from some of the news reporting? And also, is Ben Fish a reliable source? So to start, I want to break down that first set of questions, the ones that seem to be common across the internet. If we look first at the removal of clothes, that's actually pretty common in cases of hypothermia. What happens is that as the body dilates blood vessels in a last-ditch effort to warm your body, it creates a false sense of extreme warmth. And in about 25 to 50% of cases, this leads to the individual removing clothing because they actually think they're too hot. And in fact, this is so common that one of the things considered odd about the Dyatlov Pass incident is the total lack of paradoxical undressing. Right. Yeah, Dyatlov Pass was Igor Dyatlov, Lyudmila Dubinina, Zina Kolmogorova, Yuri Krivonashenko, Rustam Slobodin, Nikolai Thibault. Who am I missing still?
The Z guy.
Semyon Zolotaryov. There was one more.
You can't forget about Doroshenko.
Ah, right, Doroshenko. We always forget about Doroshenko. But yeah, Dyatlov Pass is weird because there's no paradoxical undressing, and a lot of people say there was. There wasn't. There was scavenging. They were putting more clothes on. But anyway, we have 3 videos on that already, so back to the Mark Hanson thing. The second question was the issue of his leaving the trail. Why did he choose to leave the trail? That one is a little bit more complex. And it's more complex because it includes questions of how he could have lost the trail, as well as why he would have deliberately gone the wrong way. As David Paulides correctly points out in Missing 411 Eastern United States, Hanson should not have had any reason to think that going down a hillside that steep would have brought him to the trail shelter. He should have been able to recognize the difference between the trail and the slope. But the steepness of the slope was not the only issue here. There was a lot more going into Mark Hanson's situation and his decision-making. While the Appalachian Trail certainly is a well-worn path, a snowstorm had just blown in, it was dark, and Hanson was a novice hiker. If Hanson got even slightly off track in his exhausted state, he could have easily become very disoriented. And even if he had departed the trail deliberately, it may have been an attempt to get out of the wind or to get out of the mountains. You see, the conventional wisdom that you should follow water to find civilization is usually good, but not in this situation. If you get separated on a trail and you find yourself alone and unsure which direction to go, your best option is always to stay put unless it is unsafe to do so. But Mark lacked that wisdom due to his unfamiliarity with hiking, and so he may have made a wrong decision thinking that it was the proper thing to do. Looking at the question of how he could have made it 3 miles into the drainage when he was too exhausted to continue 3/4 of a mile to the shelter, one has to consider panic. Mark was alone, in the dark, on an unfamiliar trail in what are often considered to be the spookiest woods in the United States of America. And on top of that, he had no idea how much farther he had to go, he had no supplies, and he was freezing. A lot of people would enter a state of panic under these circumstances, and panic is one hell of a motivator. It's also completely irrational, so Mark's actions would have been almost impossible to predict if he did experience a panic attack. In case you can see something currently on my shirt, little splotch, it's because I've developed a drinking problem, but by that I mean the drinking problem in the sense of the movie Airplane, where I tried to take a sip of water and spilled it on myself.
And don't call me Shirley.
But anyway, this leads us to the last question, which personally I feel relies on the assumptions of the others in order to pack the punch it attempts to deliver. Why was Mark screaming? The way it's framed in Missing 411 Eastern United States, and I'm only bringing this up because of how direct Paulides is about it, this is central to the story. This is central to what happened to Mark Hanson. And I'm not exaggerating. Paulides wrote, the key to understanding what happened to Mark Hanson is to know why he was screaming for help in the middle of the night. Paulides bases this upon the argument that Hanson would have known where the trail was, what the dangers of leaving were, and that he should have been too tired to continue on. But as we already established, Hanson was unfamiliar with the Appalachian Trail, inexperienced as a hiker, and very easily could have panicked under the circumstances. When you consider the variety of plausible explanations for Mark's actions, his frightened cries for help are actually pretty simple to explain. He was frightened and crying for help. Sure, he could have been attacked by something, but there was absolutely no sign of a struggle in the morning, and there are other possible explanations to look at. So, with all of that considered, I don't find it particularly unbelievable that Mark Hanson was just the victim of a tragic accident as a result of negligence and poor decision-making. But as I said, for my part, I wondered about 2 specific things. Why did McCarter's journal differ from the reports? And could we trust Ben Fish as a narrator? Can we trust his accounting of events? The first question would benefit from some clarification about the format of McCarter's book, which was co-authored by Ronald Schmidt. Each chapter of that book contains a narrative section which tells the story of what happened up until Dwight McCarter's involvement. And then from there, we have what is presented to be Dwight McCarter's contemporary journal of events. These entries follow McCarter's thoughts, feelings, and experiences throughout each day of the search. And after the entry, there's typically a brief conclusion wrapping up the lessons to be learned from the unfortunate experience of a lost hiker. Now, the foreword informs the reader that the narratives in this book come from the personal journal McCarter kept through his career, the text of which forms the heart of each story. This statement implies that the text of the journal was copied word for word into the book, which would suggest that it's actually an even closer source than just quotes from Miller. The text itself, however, doesn't read like a journal. It reads like a journal edited into a coherent narrative, complete with present tense verbiage. But that doesn't necessarily mean that McCarter misremembered things or even lied. It could be that Ronald Schmidt's editing is responsible for the disparities. With that said, the account given by McCarter in his journal section of the book seems to be largely in line with all of the contemporary reporting, the only contradiction that I could find being the location at which Mark Hanson dropped his backpack. The only other contradiction that really stuck out to me was related to the missing persons report, which Lost, his book, claims was made on Monday afternoon at Cosby Knob, but there may be an explanation. Reporting clearly shows that they camped at Cosby Knob shelter on Monday night, and that they reported Mark missing at Cosby campground on Tuesday morning. So that's clearly a contradiction. However, this portion is not from the section drawn from McCarter's journal, but rather from the narrative piece written by Schmidt. It's possible that Schmidt just simply got confused and combined the two locations, as Cosby Campground is never mentioned in the story. It should also be noted, by the way, that this section, where the narrative section, appears to be the origin of Fish hearing Mark Hanson screaming for help. I did not come across that claim in the journal section. And now, before we get into my other question about Ben's reliability as a witness, I want to make it clear that I'm not intending to accuse Ben Fish of anything. I'm not trying to make any positive claims that Fish did something to Hanson. I'm just trying to look at every possible angle of the story. But the reason I bring this up is that from the time Chidester left until Mark's body was found, Ben Fish was the only person to see the missing man. So we have to ask the question, can we trust the account given by Ben Fish? Off the bat, it should be noticed that there is, so far as I can tell, no reason to believe that Fish had any intention of harming Hanson when they set off for the trip. I found no evidence that the men had issues with one another, and the fact that Hanson even went on the trip in the first place would suggest he trusted Fish. There's really no information at all about Chidester. It seems that he stayed in the area, but it's unclear whether or not he participated in the search. Additionally, according to a quote from the Eastern Kentucky University campus minister, which was published in the Kentucky Post, Fish was physically drained and emotionally distraught by the experience. The article, which was published March 13, 1975, also quotes the Reverend as saying that Fish was so upset that he was unable to speak. It should also be considered that while the precise location of where Mark dropped his backpack is unclear, he definitely continued for several miles after doing so. Regardless of what Fish told the Rangers, Hanson gave up on his pack some 2 to 4 miles before leaving the trail. And we know this because Hanson must have been further along the trail when he departed it, and Fish was walking back with 2 other people. So it's not like he could have just picked Hanson's backpack up, carried it further along the trail, and dropped it to pretend that it had been there the whole time. People were with him. They would have had to be accomplices. So we know that Mark dropped the backpack and then continued along with Ben for a while. We also have to consider the fact that if Fish intended to harm Hanson or to leave him stranded, it makes little sense to do so close to the shelter where he could have theoretically found help. It also makes little sense that he would have planned to meet up with friends further along the trail, as that would simply make it more likely that he was going to get caught. But just because it doesn't make sense to conclude that Fish intended to harm Hanson, that doesn't necessarily mean that Fish's account is accurate. If Fish is unreliable, it's not necessarily because he intentionally misled anybody. If all of this truly was a tragic accident, he had just been through an incredibly traumatic experience. By the time he was telling Rangers what had happened, he was definitely exhausted and was probably recovering from mild hypothermia himself. And one symptom of hypothermia is confusion, which, by the way, should be kept in mind considering that Hanson did not have his sleeping bag that night. If he had become hypothermic, he could have become confused and wandered off. So anyway, when Ben Fish was asked where the pack was dropped, he may have been looking at a map and, unfamiliar with the exact location names, said, "I think it was there," and pointed at a spot that looked right, and it was in a Dunab, and that just happened to not be the right spot. So you may be asking then, why even consider that he misrepresented the facts? To be honest, there's not really anything that struck a nerve and caused me to look at this angle. In fact, it wasn't even this case. What it was is that when we looked at Jeff Haig, I had this nagging feeling that something was missing from that story. And it turns out I was right. I have to be honest, it wasn't me that figured that out. It was him over in the corner, my producer and co-host, Aidan Thornbury. But yeah, it turns out that there was definitely something missing from the narrative given about Jeff Haig. Now, this whole incident happened in February of 1970, just a little bit further west of where Mark Hanson went missing, near Newfound Gap. The gist of that story really quick is that Scoutmaster Eugene Smith was on a trip with his son Lee Smith and fellow Boy Scouts Jeff Haig and Stephen Wolf. And as they were returning from their campsite to their car, Jeff went missing. Now, I do want to say we have a whole video on Jeff Haig. I highly recommend watching that to understand the full extent of what I'm about to say, but just going with what's relevant to this story, you see, buried in an article from February 20th, 1970 is a detail left out of most reports. Scoutmaster Eugene Smith said that the night before Jeff disappeared, he and 2 other scouts got into a snowball fight, and apparently it got ugly. According to that article, Jeff got the worst of the scrap and was disturbed after the 3 boys were reprimanded by Smith. The paper also reported that Scoutmaster Smith felt that Jeff had intentionally parted from the group due to the altercation and lecture the night prior. It's not impossible, but it certainly seems like an overreaction and one that doesn't make a lot of sense. That wasn't the only part that bothered me either, because something is off about how Jeff got separated. The morning after that snowball fight, Eugene started back to the parking lot with Jeff and the other scout, Stephen Wolf, leaving Lee Smith, his own 15-year-old son, behind at the campsite. Ostensibly, this was so that Lee could finish packing up some of the campsite, with the expectation that he'd be only a few minutes behind and could catch up rather easily. It's implied that this is why, when Jeff asked to take a break just a few minutes and 500 yards into the hike, Eugene left him behind. It would follow that Jeff could just wait there for Lee and that the 2 could then make their way back to the parking lot together. After all, they'd barely left camp, this 500 yards. If they yelled loud enough, they probably could have still heard each other from camp. But when Lee arrived at the trail junction just minutes later, Jeff was not there. And since Lee supposedly did not know that Jeff had asked for a break, he did not know that he should be expecting Jeff to be there. As far as Lee would have known, Jeff was further along the trail with Lee's dad and Stephen Wolf. As a result, nobody noticed that Jeff was missing until all 3 of the others reached the parking lot. But if you break that down, it doesn't make any sense. If Lee Smith had only 10 minutes of packing left to do, as was suggested by his father Eugene, why leave without him? Why not just wait? The same issue applies with leaving Jeff behind. If he needed a break and Lee needed to finish up, why continue on without them? Beyond the fact that common sense would suggest that you should just wait there a few minutes instead of separating, Boy Scouts also heavily emphasizes something called the buddy system. Scouts are taught from the moment that yes, I only made it to 2nd class, but I was still a scout, we were taught that from the moment you're introduced to camping and hiking, you never go anywhere alone. You always take a buddy. And if the boys weren't following this on their own, Eugene should have been enforcing it. If he in fact did leave his son alone at the camp and then left Jeff alone at the junction, he broke the buddy system rule twice. And then there's the issue of just how short the window in which Jeff disappeared was, and the question of what could have transpired in just 10 minutes that would cause him to go the wrong way. Eugene Smith argued that Jeff probably took off on purpose and suggested that it was because of the snowball fight and the lecture the night prior. But I think that a further question is necessary to ask here, which is, what kind of snowball fight leaves a 16-year-old boy that angry with his friends? So I had to wonder, was this really just a snowball fight, or did Stephen Wolf and Lee Smith, the latter being the son of Eugene Smith, go a little further than that? For those of you who grew up in areas that get snow in the winter, think back to when you were 16, and ask yourself how many times you were read the riot act by your parents over a snowball fight. Probably never, unless you were throwing them at children, animals, or uninvolved people, right? I haven't totally worked my way through the whole thought process on this yet, so I won't speculate any further on what may have occurred until I've had time to put my thoughts together in full. What I will say now is that it seems very likely that the account of events given by Eugene Smith is inaccurate. For what reason remains to be seen. There is a lot about Jeff's case that doesn't seem to totally add up, so I would encourage you guys who haven't seen it to go and watch that video as well to get the full story. But as I said, the reason I bring this up, aside from adding on to something that was missing from our Jeff Haig video, is because the whole thing made me wonder if fish was a reliable source of information. As I said, I found no evidence to suggest that Fish brought Hanson out there to hurt him, nor do I see any evidence to suggest that Fish sent him into that drainage to die. What sticks with me is that Fish, despite knowing better, allowed an inexperienced and unprepared Hanson to push on into worsening conditions with no shelter for 7 miles. Considering that one member of the group had already turned back, I cannot see a valid reason to push on from Cosby Knob's shelter. After all, they clearly didn't plan to meet up with their friends at Tri-Corner Knob Shelter, as they were not there when Fish arrived on Monday morning. They could have stayed at Cosby Knob, or they could have turned back and gone to Cosby Campground and informed their friends ahead of them on the trail that they weren't going to make it. The only answer that I can really come up with is the idea of, not wanting to look weak in front of your other male friends, but they both had an out since Chidester had already departed from the group by that point. But even if we could attribute this to bravado, I can't wrap my head around the decision to continue onwards after Hanson said he could no longer carry his pack. That should absolutely never be on the table in a situation like this. At the very least, they should have camped in place. A better choice would have been to push back down towards Cosby Knob Shelter, which we know they could have done. And we know that because Mark made it almost all the way to Tri-Corner Knob, which is further away from Camel Gap than Cosby Knob Shelter. It's not the most interesting or entertaining explanation, but in this case it does seem most likely that people just made bad decisions. And I know that's not the most fun conclusion that a video can ever have, but even if we were to consider something paranormal like Bigfoot or the Wendigo in this situation, that also wouldn't make any sense. I've never come across a Bigfoot story that involved somebody being kidnapped for a trail, not harmed physically at all, and then just deposited somewhere to freeze to death. And as for a Wendigo, well, neither Haig nor Hanson had been eaten. If I tap into my fantasy writer side, the most realistic notion I can come up with is that a tribe of wild men or cultists were luring kids off trail as sacrifices to the god of winter or something. It would make some sense anthropologically speaking, and the Smokies do have a lot of space to hide, but it just seems so out there given the alternatives. So, 2 investigations into this Great Smoky Mountains cluster, I'm leaning towards Hanson being an accident and Haig being either an accident or foul play. That said, I have scanned through the others in the book, and not all of them are so straightforward as these 2 are, especially in cases where a body is not found. And in the next episode in this series, we'll be taking a look at Trenny Gibson, a high schooler whose disappearance from a trail near Klingman's Dome matches that description. With all that said, however, if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can become a member of this channel or a member on Patreon for just $1 a month. That'll get you access to some perks like our monthly Liquored Lore show, which is where Aiden and I get a little silly and talk about something from the past. It will also get you access to transcripts of these videos as well as the original script that I read while we do them, because it's slightly different. I often riff. I will tell you that over on Patreon at the higher tiers, you do start to run into some little perks like mugs, posters, even a hoodie if you go for the highest tier. So if you're choosing between the 2, I would recommend Patreon. And aside from the exclusive content that you get from the memberships that you have there, you can also catch us live on Sunday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern. We do a live show. Every other week we have a guest, and the weeks that are off, we just talk about the cases we've covered since the last 2 weeks. You can also get more Lodge by going to the Weird Bible Podcast channel, the Aiden Mattis channel, the Lore Lounge, the History Hut. Those don't have content yet. But I also have been harping on this. We have brought on new hosts to do new shows. So we have a couple coming in the works. Those are right now about music and about bartending and bar stories and just the craziness that goes on in that industry, as well as some instructional stuff on how to make drinks. Celso is a magician. And as far as somehow knowing everyone in the music industry somehow, our other host, Luke Eccles, is going to be doing Off the Record, his show, where he's going to be interviewing everybody from bar managers who set up gigs all the way up through rock stars. I think Creed's manager's coming on the show, right?
Soon,
Yeah, Creed's manager is going to be on the show. Creed. I guess Luke came to him with arms wide open and, with one last breath, he's going to take us higher. If you're wondering when stuff is going to be coming out, the best ways that you can make that happen are to click that notification bell, check our community posts, and of course, join our Discord. Discord is where you get basically first news of everything for us. You can get there by going to bit.ly/join the lodge. If you'd like to wear the Lore Lodge, you'll soon be able to do that in American-made gear from Bunker Branding. But if feeling like you're in our skin isn't enough and you'd prefer to drink the lodge, you can do so by going to Tableau Roasting Company. The link is in the description. They have Mount Pocono Perk. I designed it myself with the assistance of Matt Moore down there. Two great minds came together and created a coffee that is just perfect. Aiden and I both actually drink our own coffee every day, and it's not because we get it for free. We also have turned on most of our friends and family to it. It's like I give this to I go out of my way to buy this and give it to people as gifts because it's that good. Why is it that good? It's because I spent entirely too much time around coffee people growing up. Well, with all that said, I'm Aiden Mattis. I've had cotton mouth this entire time, and it's been really hard to speak, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.